Another scholar is Willy Brandt, Distinguished University Professor of Anthropology and Historical Studies at the New School for Social Research and has been founding director of its Institute for Critical Social Inquiry since 2014. She is also one of the founding editors of Political Concepts, a critical lexicon. She has worked for some 35 years on the politics of knowledge, colonial governance, the racial and sexual politics of empire, and the ethnography of archives. She has been a visiting professor at the École des Études en Sciences Sociales, École Nationale Supérieure in Paris, Bedside in Ramallah, and the Bard Prison Initiative, among others. Her books include Race and Education of Desire, Carnal Knowledge and Imperial Power, Along the Archival Grain, and Duress from 2016. And please, would you like to?
I guess we have to leave. Thank you all for staying so long. I know that it's been a really long day and amazing talks, and everybody must be exhausted. But I do appreciate that you're still here, those of you who are. I'm kind of a fish out of water in this conference because I think I was invited because I've been working on archives for some 40 years, colonial archives in particular, and archives that are very, very much about the political. For me, there's really no discussion of archives unless one looks at what I call the force fields in which they're invested, in which they're shaped, and how they're created. So far in the conference, there hasn't been that much discussion, actually, of the politics of knowledge. And for me, that's just the starting point altogether. And so, having worked on colonial governance and the archives as a particular kind of technology of rule in itself, I've found it really exciting to think about how one might approach the archive of the avant-garde. An avant-garde that in my mind needs to be looked at not in Europe, but elsewhere and otherwise. And when I say elsewhere and otherwise, I'm thinking of a larger imperial landscape, not one that's all white, not one that is just governed by what Paris and Berlin think is an avant-garde, but maybe a more expansive notion of what it could possibly mean, and who has the authority to say this is avant-garde and this is not. So, that's what I'll be talking about today. So I want to thank you for coming, and I want to thank Stephen for making this happen at all, and not least to thank the whole committee for stretching me to reach beyond my decades of working with, in, and on the edges of colonial archives to consider what an archive might look like of the avant-garde. Now, most of the people who have spoken so far, and this is sort of the irony of what's happening in this conference, have all spoken only about the archive. Well, I've been talking about the archive for 40 years. That's all I talk about is the archive. Archiving dissensus in Ramallah, all the different forms in which the archive constrains us and shapes us. I decided I wanted to talk here about the avant-garde and what we might do about it, in which nobody, basically, has put with an interrogation mark, what is the avant-garde? So after these decades of working with, in, and on the edges of the colonial archives, to consider what an avant-garde might look like, what would constitute the warp and weft of archival practices with respect to it. So I'd like to address, and I don't know how much I'm going to get to it, but this is a beginning, actually, of in some ways, of a new project for me. The principles and the politics of authorization that names something or someone avant-garde. And in so doing, I ask what issues get raised when you ask that question of authorization. What problematics might be underscored? What politics might be mandated by a naming and a locating of an avant-garde askew to, but decidedly in relationship to its Euro-American center? So it's not taking as its core the Euro-American center. In culling and curating an other archive, might we also find the tools and the political grammar to identify an avant-garde poised on the fractious fault lines of colonialisms and imperial violences, animating new ways of fracturing that force now. So I'm really challenged and intrigued by this task that I'm taking to be a speculative one, and actually an invitation to us all to think of it as a speculative one, since we don't have it already formulated avant-garde of this elsewhere and otherwise. To rethink and recraft an archive of the avant-garde that engages as it calls into question and destabilizes the nature of both terms, both the avant-garde and of the archive, and what can constitute an archive. The paradox, I think, is there from the start, in the very juxtaposition which the terms put before us. An archive, by nature, in its emergence, assumes a will. One has to already know that about an archive. It's got a will and a force of its own, the second it comes into any instantiation. It surreptitiously imposes category making, whether you want to or not. That's part of what happens with the command of the archive. It creates sharply marked divisions between information and debris. That's one of its essential features. It's got to decide what's junk. It's got to decide what gets thrown out. It sets out draconian rules of engagement. No pens are in the demi-cercle at the Bibliothèque Nationale, right? No photocopying, no cameras, ultimately really no access. And at least, it elevates its own criteria of relevance as sacred in wielding its command. So already implicitly, unspoken, or a set, a logic that's already operating within it. An avant-garde, on the other hand, is poised consciously to do the opposite, or at the very least, resist the nomos of classification, the norm of order, transgress the restrictions and constrictions that common sense so easily imposes, even without an explicit command. And we'll return to common sense in a moment. We might remember here the warning. Am I speaking too loud, or do I not need this? I have such a bellowing voice. Oh, it's better? Okay. No, sometimes people just go, can you talk lower, Anne? So we might remember the warning of Arlette Farge, the luminous French historian of the 17th century who worked with Michel Foucault, a warning that I take as one of my archival mantras, when she writes that an archive is, I quote, an adversary to fight, a piece of knowledge that isn't to annex, but to disrupt. It's not simply a matter of undoing something whose meaning is too easy to find, but to be able to know it, you have to unlearn and not think you know from a first reading, unquote. So whatever this archive already includes, we should be on our guard against its demands, because archives put demands on you, whether you're aware of it or not. Such an alert in part defines my venture. In asking what principles and politics of authorization name something or someone as avant-garde, and without assuming who or what might care or remain totally indifferent to make a claim to membership, I wonder what unexposed scaffolding might be brought into view by asking what the label carries. We've been using it again and again. And to whom the label, or some would say the epithet, applies. What sort of archive might it summon? And what might go into its curation and making? And in the spirit of an avant-garde, What are the subversions, as we heard earlier, we might perform in doing so? What are the subversive acts this particular avant-garde and this particular archive might do? It's a query that takes Adorno's warning seriously, that no concept comes without a surfeit, an excess that spills beyond its declared edges. It is precisely those edges, both of a possible archive, and I'd like to think of that as a potential archive, and of a possibly radically different circumscribed avant-garde, to which I'm drawn. My thought is this: might we, as the infamous and wondrous Filipino novelist José Rizal thought to do with his subversive novels on the cusp of the 20th century, alter our compass and invert the lens that has the gaze of Europe riveted on the colony, and turn that gaze the other way around. I'm thinking here of the aesthetics of dissent and the poetics of politics, not as they emerged in their Euro-American core, but on a broader imperial map and in a cascade of moments and movements where anti-colonialisms, in an astounding transnational series of successive interventions made and performed, were both similar and not quite the same. This is key for me. There's something successive, there's something cascading in this anti-colonial archive, as it's constantly in formation and reformation, producing one of the dominant and most disruptive and eruptive forms of popular global politics. Animated by histories of empire, colonialisms over varied duration and breadth, racialized architectures and infrastructures of segregation, this modeled mix of innovative, unacceptable artists, novelists, poets, illustrators, journalists, editors mobilized their dissensions to produce an irreverent aesthetics and recalcitrant politics. It is precisely at the edges of such a potential archive, and in these outer folds of what might be considered avant-garde, to which I'm drawn, this anti-colonial compendium of possibilities and visions, breathing in a clogged and embattled space of which I admit to only know a fraction. I'm not pretending this is the entire world, global avant-garde, anti-colonial avant-garde that I know. Small, short-lived journals in the insurgent Dutch East Indies on the cusp of becoming Indonesia. Journals with flaming poetry and politics from Morocco. Reviews that circulated across the Antilles. Books published and immediately banned. Think Fanon's Wretched of the Earth a day later. A succession of Asian-African congresses, sometimes stifled by performative posturing, but that more importantly, if we put aside that posturing of Zhou Enlai and Nehru and Sukarno all puffing their chests, more importantly, took their anti-European and anti-white supremacy politics as their founding premise. Here has been a vortex of dissent, negritude, anti-negritude, racisms under the radar and in bold font, anti-racism as well, communism, Asian-African alliances, enabling and crushing Marxisms and utopian visions that competed, converged, vied for ascendancy, colliding and sometimes collaborating in their assertion of aesthetic form and political claim. The two have to go together in this particular context. I'm not suggesting that these anti-colonial avant-gardes, of which I'm in pursuit, were an ensemble, but rather that they show repeated evidence of a set of commitments that came out of the colonial condition, a condition born in one's sensibilities, sensory regimes, and in the flesh. Colonial conditions reshape temporalities. They bear on the global order and the local microphysics of social life. Within this potential anti-colonial archive in the making, we would be alert to this condition that was shared, primary, prioritized, and recursively present in different locations. It didn't all look the same, providing strongholds of thought and what Rancière would call dissensual practices across the world. Elsewhere, I've called that condition colonial duress, to underscore the hardened, tenacious qualities of colonial effects, their extended, protracted temporalities, and not least their durable, if sometimes intangible, constraints and confinements. But note also, endurance figures here in this etymology as well, as a counterman to duress and its disabling qualities. Colonial duress, though, is not a matter resolved by an official transfer of sovereignty, nor could colonial effects be relegated to the passé composé. Those afflicted sought out a politics for whom Jacques Rancière's definition of the political would have made enormous dissensual sense, not as confrontation, so much as he put it, a gap in the sensible, a partage du sensible, a making visible that which had no reason to be seen within that particular colonial regime of truth. And this is precisely what those dissenting from the colonial order of things did through their visual and verbal poetics, novels, and reviews. As Gary Wilder has shown in a celebratory and carefully researched study of decolonization through the lens of two extraordinary persons, the two who were called upon the most frequently, who we know, Aimé Césaire and Léopold Senghor. Theirs was a rejection, straight out, of instrumental reason in favor of what Césaire would call poetic truth. It's a really wonderful term. And the journal Tropique, that was the signature of the group with whom he worked, that included his wife Suzanne, about which I'll have more to say, and friend René Ménil, and that thrived for 6 to 7 years precisely through some of the ugliest, most heavily censored Vichy years in the 1940s, made poetic truth a truth about the colonial order of things, and a rejection of that order in these anti-colonial, anti-fascist, alternative imaginaries and potential worlds. As Wilder notes, and I just would read 2 sentences of his because Gary's done a lot of work in this direction around these two particular people. Césaire, during the late 1930s, while studying in Paris, participated in overlapping social circles drawn from expatriate colonial students, a transnational Black public sphere, and the literary avant-garde. These were the spaces from and in which he helped to fashion the cultural and political project that, as we know, was called Negritude, right? Césaire's notebook of a return to my native land, published in 1947, on the cusp of his return to Martinique after studying in France, famously captured what he called not just poetic truth, but poetic knowledge. It's a really interesting term. A rare, organic appreciation of aesthetics and politics that Wilder too notes was beyond any opposition, any easy opposition of the two, and that's what intrigues me. There's not one can't be separated from the other. Césaire was exemplary, but he was not alone. Suzanne Césaire, very rarely spoken about, in her own right, was a force in the making of Tropique, schooled in philosophy at Paris's most elite École Normale Supérieure, where she met Aimé. Muted in history, one has a sense from her writing and her photographic presence is just utterly exquisite, that sort of maybe even took over some of the space of her brilliance, right? That her voice then must have been crystalline sharp and bolder than has been recognized or ever acknowledged since. A recent collection of her writing in Tropique, published for the first time in 2012. Think how long after, never published before. Well, Amé is all over the place, right? Under the title, The Great Camouflage. Her best-known work suggests a vivid, fresh, cosmopolitan vantage on the work that the trope of camouflage did for her to target the sordid system of post-slavery debt. Who else has spoken about post-slavery debt, right? Political smokescreens, as she put it, bad faith. And in response, her anticipatory response, an emergent vision of what others would later call a pan-Caribbean poetics of liberation. There is an immense groundedness to the aesthetics, rooted in Caribbean light and place. But there is also a way in which one might imagine currents and currencies of utter movement, mobilities, and motion. I'm really intrigued by this, how grounded they are and how much these people are moving itineraries that are just extraordinary. Voluntary and involuntary displacements. César learning from and leaning on Segure. André Breton, captivated by César. The latter's voice in Breton's words, I quote, beautiful like nascent oxygen. And then César, animated by Breton. Fanon turning back to César. Eduardo Glissant building on both, and Abdallah Latif in Morocco holding up his pen to the light of Fanon. But then there were waves from other shores, and I think we got some sense of that from the earlier presentations, of movements in Asia that barely made contact with these Caribbean fires and cross-fertilizations. Some of those from pre-independence Indonesia, never in the story. If you ever talk about the avant-garde, Indonesia's like out of the picture. Of course, it's out of the picture of post-colonialism too. It's out of everybody's picture, except mine. Well, no, not except mine, but those of us who have worked and lived for decades in Indonesia, it's very hard to understand just why it's always askew to everything that's on South Asia, on Southeast Asia. But some of these were from pre-independence Indonesia, were peopled with persons who were incandescent, ironic, and fierce, as was the case with the brazen Indies. They called themselves the Bergerakan. That is the movement. That included on its journal's mastheads young activist poets and novelists far before independence. Mas Marco, who fought, as Takahashi Shirashi put it, a war in language that was violent and more than a war of just words. Shirashi's study, which is only really read by Indonesianists, is amazing, and Age in Motion documents and archives an Indonesian cultural politics between 1912 and 1926, 14 years, that left almost no form of inscription, no sort of activity or opportunity for incitement untouched. These guys were amazing. Newspapers, journals, strikes, novels, songs, theater, and twisting word and world plays that reduced and inverted the pomposity of Dutch colonial soliloquy to the language of the gutter, and labeled the obsequious bowing and scraping requisite in high Javanese circles as, I quote, the custom of frogs. That is adat godokan. In the 1950s, these artists and poets adhering to Lekra was the cultural institution, the sort of weapon of the Indonesian Communist Party, turned to socialist realism, and it's kind of a fading out that you see here, that no one's really worked on this, with a vengeance that seemed to have squeezed out a more subversive aesthetics. But we really don't have enough to go on. This is the invitation to do more. The well-known Indonesian novelist, essayist, poet, Sitor Sitomorang was one of the, I should just say I worked for many years in Indonesia on Uniroyal and Goodyear plantations, and I worked in Java for 2 years as well, so the Indonesian part is very close to my heart. Sitomorang was one of the foremost interlocutors of the American author Richard Wright, who I think most of you must know who he is, who has spent time with before and during the Bandung Conference. While the narrative artistry of someone like Pramudia Anantatur, who was up for the Nobel Prize, cut through the darkness of interments with his stories whispered between cells in the night. Orality, the carceral, and writing, melding in the stories he told and how he told them. Both Sitomorang and Tur were imprisoned by Suharto for decades. Rudolf Mrazak, an historian, has called the most famous internment camp, Bovendigul, a site of, it's a great term, concentrated marginity, precisely because there were such creative figures clustered together in these internment camps, for years nourishing one another with their politics of obstinacy and recalcitrant prose. Look, I'm admittedly loose here with time, with who met who, where, and when, knowing less what, because I don't really know, what gelled into prose and poetics, and what evaporated in the waft of cheap clove cigarettes on restless nights. Still, some of these connectivities, which is what I'm really interested in, the divisions cut across the Caribbean and the US. Fanon was adamant against the bards of negritude. Negritude now is being just hailed as the answer. Fanon just totally dissed it out of hand. Others moving from Algeria and Morocco back to France. Those impatient, too, with what they called stale Moroccan stories and folkloric authors. And then others moving between the Caraïbes and Algeria. And then, of course, there was what is often called the watershed of Bandung in 1955. Now, undoubtedly, most of you, closer to my age, though there are not that many close to my age, right, are familiar with the Bandung Conference. But for those of a generation that might not be, let me just tell you a little about it. It was considered the first Congress of non-aligned Asian African leaders for a New World Order, to which former and contemporary colonizing states were not invited. Absolutely, categorically. France, US, out. Belgium, out. It was held in the drab, and I think there was pleasure in doing so. It was held in the drab West Javanese city of Bandung. Attendance included stately sorts, Zhou Enlai, Nehru, Sukarno, leaders from 29 states, and then quadruple the number of journalists from all over the world. You go on the internet, you just see one picture after another of everybody in their stately attire. I tried to find sort of regular, normal people, but they're only sort of in the background waving their hands. For these nascent countries just out or in the throes of independence, Bandung announced an unprecedented anti-colonial, anti-imperialist mandate. And the manifesto was actually in their very co-presence. It was just being there together without any whites leading the show. The exhilaration of Bandung, partially conveyed in Richard Wright's, he wrote enormously on it. He called it the Indonesian Notebooks, written on the night train, first class from Paris to Madrid, was in many ways a conventional and somewhat caricatured, almost naively ethnographic account of a rather parochial American abroad, though Wright insisted that it was the profusion of persons of color from so many places that grabbed and stirred everyone and held him fast. Indonesian participants at Bandung complained that Wright was obsessed with the oppressions of racism over the oppressions of colonialism. So much more of the Bandung Conference was galvanized around that. In retrospect, though, Stasis Kogorias and Amir Mufti, who've been engaged in a 5-year project on Bandung, argue that the Bandung effect went far beyond the event itself, giving rise to a flourishing of something really interesting, a multilingual literary journals that thought of themselves as an avant-garde and spoke of themselves in that way, part of what they called a universal humanism to which they feel we should be looking today. What they call late Bandung thinkers, I think that's a great term, late Bandung thinkers, brought politics and poetics organically together as they sought to change the world. Though many argue that it was 1978, with the publication of Edward Said's Orientalism, that marks the most incisive critique of colonialism, others looking to the post-Bandung fluorescence date it some 20 years earlier. Such journals as Lotus. Has anyone ever heard of Lotus? Yes? Oh, good. Okay, well, a few. Not enough, right? Lotus made Syrian poetry available to anti-colonial dissidents everywhere. A trilingual quarterly that moved with politics from Beirut to Lebanon, insistently bypassing the metropole as it traveled. These movements were not necessarily coordinated, and I think that's important to underscore, so much as they are animated by similar anti-colonial and anti-imperial impulses of which their participants were increasingly aware that they shared. This was a protracted conjunctural set of cascading moments again, and persons whose aesthetic does not reduce to their artwork, and this was what you were saying so beautifully earlier, right? It was not only through their artwork. It was, and you can see it in all of the photos and in the language they used. It was in what they thought, what they read, how they wrote, the music they listened to, how they spoke, how they moved and dressed. One can almost see the casting and carving out of a set of dispositions in formation. This was not subservient to a white middle class. In this world, they worked to unhinge from its certitudes and propel into motion. Perhaps it was then how they were and what they cultivated in themselves, in that sense that Foucault talks about the cultivation of the self, both a confident stance, not what Manoni wrote about of the inferiority complex of the colonized, but a confident stance and a radical vision and an abiding adherence to be recalcitrant, to recalcitrant politics. Their aesthetic was grounded in their politics, but with care, not to instrumentalize it, not to be caught by a rigid frame. It was a politics in which the duress of racism and colonialism was key. It shaped what other faces should come into view, what kind of alliances they sought to activate and not bother activating, and what kinds of questions they sought to address. They stood firmly, if not always successfully, on the conviction that critique was not to win out over the poetic, but there was a poetics of dissent, and that artistry mattered to politics. Unacceptabilities is defining an avant-garde. Might we pause for a moment to defining an avant-garde and ask what might be garnered from such an exercise of an avant-garde elsewhere and otherwise? Susan Buck-Morris writes something, a dear friend, but I don't agree. Let me quote. From an empirico-historical descriptive point of view, it is enough for artists to call themselves avant-garde, for them to be it. For them to be it. And then she writes in parentheses, the Western art strategy. But from a philosophical viewpoint, the artwork itself must demonstrate the claim, within and against its historical context. Artwork, not artists, are avant-garde. And even here, the category is not constant. Well, as I said, I'm not sure I agree. When we turn to the personhoods cultivated as avant-garde, something else emerges, this creative recalcitrance in life and labor. We might begin by taking seriously its social etymology. And I'm sure others, over the next 2 days and before I arrived this afternoon at 1 o'clock might have rehearsed it already. But an avant-garde, as we know, derives, has anybody said it yet? From the French advance guard of an army, a small group of armed combatants moving ahead of the rest. Little more is usually said about weaponry, but I think we miss some of the ways in which the anti-colonial avant-garde imagined not only aesthetics as a weapon, but their poetics and use of language as a battlefield as well. I like what my friend, poet professor Omar Bareda parses. He says, to say something is avant-garde is at once to make a claim, an intervention, attributing to it the capacity to bring about an interruption. I think that interruption is key. Common definitions refer to that which is avant-garde as innovative, unorthodox, or radical. Enough of each to be endowed, as Richard Castellance's Dictionary of the Avant-Gardes put it, and he writes, with initial unacceptability. Well, I think we should be vigilantly attentive to that limiting temporality that is to the initial, unacceptability. What André Breton once called the first article of the avant-garde's charter gets to the heart of the summons, a temporal moment, a reaction to a prevailing norm. He says, the avant-garde is to celebrate, I quote, a deliberate will to deal the coup de grâce to that which one calls common sense, which does not stop short of calling itself reason. In the case at hand, this unseemly, ugly, easy to think common sense, to which Breton alludes, in its dominant racialized mode, was a colonial common sense about people, about differences, about distinctions that mattered and that were made to do so. These were the negative coordinates against which anti-colonial critique was aimed. Clifford Geertz, my only reference to an anthropologist, even though I am one, wants to find, I don't usually quote Clifford, wants to find common sense. He did a great study of common sense, and then he just left it aside. He says it's a relatively organized body of considered thought, neither instinctive, as we often think of common sense, nor based on experience, but rather a set of, I quote, historically constructed judgments. It need not be uttered or named. It may, as imperial common sense was, embody and target the body as racialized ascription, or as Aimé Césaire put it, thingification. That was the word as he used over and over again. I always just think I'm so loud that I don't need it, right? Aimé Césaire conceptually nailed it with thingification. Techniques of dehumanizing, minute and searingly present, a gross submetrics of degradations, humiliations, expressed as care, persons treated as body parts, fragmented as things. Such common sense can invite its own alternatives, as in avant-garde challenges that were neither uttered, too loud, or named. Breton, as those chronicling his encounter with the Césars likes to tell it, discovered the journal Tropique in a grocery store. Everybody loves to say that he found it in a grocery store. On a brief layover in Fort-de-France, from the ship he was on making its way to New York. He was astounded by Tropique's force and sophistication, but more so by a poetry of dissent. He put it, a poetically rich and revolutionary deployment of language. It was also, as Suzanne César's essays epitomize, an astounding capacity, he noted, of writing in code in precarious times, of movement around censorship, seized books, shut down, and internment. As striking to my mind was César's assault on colonial common sense, his observation of what he called, I quote, a willful blindness of history, and of, I quote, and to me this is the most important line, the work it takes not to see, unquote. The work it takes not to see. This was for me, personally, an uncanny resonance with what I had spent decades in the Dutch colonial archives observing, witnessing, impressed with what I then called a skittish scene, the averted gaze that imperial dispositions cultivated, followed by a turn away. I track that knowing and not knowing, that turn from what one knows, a simultaneous recognition and refusal to know, in journals, letters, official correspondence, and confidential reports of colonial civil servants. I'd get really close to it, then I'd fumble, and then I'd track it again. Exactly what César seemed to know better. What I've called a disposition of disregard, and elsewhere colonial aphasia, the latter, a political condition in which the occlusion of knowledge is at once a dismembering of words from the objects to which they refer, a difficulty retrieving both the semantic and lexical components of vocabularies, a loss of access that may verge on active dissociation, a difficulty comprehending what's seen and spoken. So in a shorter hand, César said very much the same thing, right? This willful, the work it takes not to see. But he doesn't go more deeply into it. The politics of imperial disregard describes yet something else, marked by a negative space. And I wrote this, I'm just going to read you one line, 2 lines from Along the Archival Grain. That from which those with privilege and standing could excuse themselves, in which César refused to excuse anyone. I called this ability to excuse oneself from wrought engagement, this refusal to witness, and the almost legal legitimacy recusal confers, as in French, as the well-tended conditions of disregard. It's not that ethics are absent. Rather, they provide exemption from what one need not do, one need not look at, and one need not say. Breton shared another observation in his exuberant, laudatory 1979 preface to César's notebook on a return to the native land. The poetics of dissent was captured, he said, in the very lettered being of César. It's quite an amazing passage in which Breton, in turn, regales the reader with César's appreciation, and it's really his appreciation of César, of the young trilingual poet, the Comte de Lautréamont, born in Uruguay, schooled on Baudelaire, Byron, and Poe, and like César, impassioned by a form of poetry that in itself was a writ of expropriation. A poet who understood, again as did César, and I underline this because I think it's so great, that poetry starts with excess, disproportion, and quests deemed unacceptable. These are all transgressive and radical moves that one might argue embrace the very definition of what constitutes an avant-garde. Anti-colonialism was there for some of the European avant-garde, but could never be as central as it was for those whose lives were framed by that which they fought against. My real point here is that there was a kind of organic politics to the anti-colonial avant-garde that the European avant-garde could never have to the same extent. When in 1925 Breton wrote the first Surrealist manifesto, it was a year in which he notoriously, as James Clifford has noted, made a stance on the side of anti-colonial rebels in Morocco where France was engaged, and he puts it a minor colonial war. Actually, it wasn't so minor. Some historians considered the Rif War, which brought colonial Spain and France together to defeat a Moroccan army, the first war to use tanks and aircraft, and I quote, a harbinger of the decolonization process in North Africa, or, as some have put it, the last colonial war. Not least, it could be considered, as some historians have, a precursor to the Algerian War of Independence 3 decades later. Invariably accused of trespassing and transgressing norms, those two are key. The militant poets of the anti-colonial moment did just that again and again. I'm not even sure that one can say that their origins, because people love originary myths, that their origins were in Morocco or in Martinique or in Indonesia or in Paris. I think what's more interesting that we haven't yet found the vocabulary, I think, quite for, is that they were these these sort of imagined itineraries of meaning and aspiration, that they were in absolute movement. And such itineraries make sense of something else. Should we think to other reasons for turning an account of the avant-garde to colonial conditions and imperial formations, we might also invoke again Breton, one of many who considered the avant-garde, I don't know how many of you would consider it immediately, as the hallmark of the modern. It's just sort of a given. That is what is modernity, is the avant-garde. Should it be the modern we're after, then it's the colonial and imperial formations that offer us a point of access, that are not those that convention would have us otherwise make. At one level, then, I call this a speculative project, but in other ways, it is decidedly as not. For it traverses a breadth of thinking and practice that questions how we even come close to understanding what might be considered what is modernity or the modern. It's taken some 2 decades, probably more, of a scrutinizing, critical colonial studies to pry the concept of the modern from its hermetically sealed European home and to ask what that protective shielding has displaced. Just a very, very brief partial detour through these alternative histories that just make total sense when they're together. For nearly 30 years, Uday Mehta has insisted, since his first piece on liberalism and the politics of exclusion, that the rise of liberalism and exclusion built into its structure were in deep relationship with the pragmatics of empire. So there's no modernity, no liberalism without empire. Race, as I've argued for the same amount of time, ensured that no matter what the de jure requirements of access to citizenship might be under modernity, there were always unspoken credentials that were as prescriptive and exclusionary as anything else. They could be language, comportment, rearing or dress, or those elements of the everyday through which dispositions are trained. These were gatekeepers that ensured that citizenship was constrained by racial coordinates. And then in places like the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, few natives could possibly garner the cultural competencies and credentials that would make them eligible of European equivalence and therefore modern. Or we might look to, even more so, the Argentinian philosopher Enrique Dussel, right? Who for decades as well has pursued a critical argument building on dependency theory of the 1960s, not that different from it actually, but think of the Ghanaian activist historian Walter Rodney, that posited that no development in Europe was possible without underdevelopment of other colonized parts of the world. Dussel made that case even stronger, not only assaulting the pretense of development, but more broadly the very condition of modernity itself on a global scale. The argument, namely that there really was no modernity without what he called its underside, the underside of modernity, is empire. That is, of a rapacious system of territorial conquest, of expansive imperial formations. Here, the underside of modernity is empire, and the underside of the avant-garde. Irene Silverblatt's Modern Inquisitions is an amazing book that's argued that the very technologies of bureaucracy, state racism, and documenting torture, which are so much a part of modern states and our modern world, were honed in the imperial corridors of the Inquisition. And finally, but not least, has been a well-rehearsed formulation of colonial studies that the colonies were the actual and most robust, I quote, laboratories of modernity, where experiments could be conducted, materials tried out, where labor was cheaper, and no protocols were in the way to protect those subjected to them. The first museums in Indochina were filled with local art salvaged as railway construction sites, felled forests, and emptied fertile swamps. Such selective conservation and managed restoration turned the colonies into laboratories of modernity, but not only, as often thought, for architectural enhancement, as a notion could be misconstrued, but for the infrastructure of extraction, unfettered experimentation, in segregated sewage channels for Europeans or Israelis, urban organizations that kept Vietnamese away from whites, displacing people and ecological balances, were fundamental to the choreographies of apartheid. They were colonial and modern things. This constellation of perceptions and practices that depended so on the peripheral colonial world, as we know, we're not peripheral at all. Sid Mintz has argued, and I won't go through all of them, but just one more, has argued that the first sites of industrialized factory production were not even close to Lancaster's wool mills, but were the sugar factories of the Caribbean, where mills and turbines and industrialized labor made sugar the elixir of an overworked industrial labor force in Europe, and on whose profits the luxuriant country homes of the British gentry were made. I'm trying to make sure that you see one can't be dealt with without the other. So how does this refigure how we might understand and recalibrate what constitutes an avant-garde and its locations? Of course, the sustained argument is that there is nothing peripheral about colonialism except a European-bound vision of it. In this peripheral vision, we find not the margins of Europe, but, as I would argue, the very conditions and relations that shaped Europe as an entity, what it was and what it still is. This isn't to say that there is no work on the avant-garde that notes some of its outlying practitioners on Europe's fringe. I mean, there are all kinds of books that will kind of maybe mention César, maybe mention Michel Leiris, where he went. But something else has rarely been addressed, namely the conditions that made the anti-colonial avant-garde more political than some of its most well-known central adherents and advocates. For the anti-colonial avant-garde, there was no avant-garde that could subscribe to or entertain the option of a muted politics. As Suzanne César wrote in The Great Camouflage, subterfuge, fictive history, deception were hallmarks of colonial rule that had to be called out by their name. This was the politics of poetic knowledge. Naming was a way of laying bare, exposing the disguises of colonial contortions, making graspable and visible for all to see. For she and her Martinican cohort, politics was in the brash poetics and constitutive of how they would understand their art and their politics. Among these multiple generations of persons, some had family genealogies steeped in the histories of slavery, some didn't. They had lives that remained marked with the sort of interpolations Fanon would take as a founding moment of a racialized identity when the little boy says, "Ew, a black man." And a mirror that threw it so often back in his face, and others still who, like the Césars, attended the most prestigious universities in Paris. So you can't make it all a story of suffering, right? It's a much more complicated story than that. They were so privileged in some ways and so brilliant. It was in Europe where their difference was foisted on them. What's so striking and clear from the poetry, I'm almost done, from the phrases and the vocabulary, is that the fantasy that there was a world of color that wanted to be white was a white fiction of its own. And it is throughout the colonial archives, how much everything is geared towards how much they really want to be us. As Sian Nagai has argued, wanting to have and wanting to be are not the same. Not least, I would argue that they produce strikingly different politics. Imagining that there was a whole world that wanted to be white was more than a white fantasy. It was part of the very microphysics of colonial rule, built into the architecture of security regimes, domestic household management, and public space. It was and is a European fantasy fostered, regenerated, and sustained by far more than the blatantly racist far right. And we know that to be true today. On the prose and politics of inspiration, souffle. Let's turn to a moment. It is really the end. To one of the places this tacking between different clusters of this anti-colonial avant-garde has taken me, because it really is in a kind of archipelago of it. One is to a Moroccan nexus, where the language is angry and bold and riven with furious grace. Take the initial stanzas of Mustafa Nisaburi's poem, Manobula, meaning manpower. So that you may doubt our origins even more, we offer you bodies for the salvation of humanity factories, with ablutions, peaceful bodies, on the sand placement offices, leathery bodies, tubercular history, us dogs, the perfidious ones, us of Paleolithic brain, squinty eyes, thermonuclear liver, bodies with wooden tables where it's written that underdevelopment is our congenital disease. And sir and madam, and thank you, without forgetting our interminable procession of yellow teeth and stupors and blood, half tree, bodies nourished on locusts and camel piss. We are not even epileptic. That's only the beginning of the poem. There is nothing timid here about calling things by their names. Appearing in the journal Souffle, that later was named, first it came out in French, then it came out in French and Arabic, en face. Because it first appeared in French, then in Arabic, souffle referred literally to a breath or blast, and then furtively to inspiration. So it sort of plays both of those. It was just that when it appeared in the mid-1960s, a good 20 years after César's Tropique. But no, both of these really small town journals, right, that came out and that were without any capital to support them. Its generator and editor-in-chief, Abdallah Labi, not only spearheaded its production, but understood souffle as what he called a form of hand-to-hand combat. I love that. An assault on milquetoast poetics and of prose that disappears in the dust. Some have argued that souffle itself was a precursor, an inaugural spring that anticipated and made a space for today's revolts against authoritarian regimes. There were few, if any, Maghrébins in Bandung in 1955, but the lineages of dissent are resolutely there. As Olivia Harrison and Teresa Villaignacio, the skilled editors of a beautifully translated collection of Souffle's writing in English now, just recently out. It was never just a Moroccan affair. So we're not calling it some like ethnic, sealed off space, but a tricontinental one that embraced Haitian writers, Syrian poets, and the 10-point program of the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers appear again and again. The manifesto was a preferred genre of the avant-garde, as we all know, but it was also for the anti-colonial avant-garde as well. These were summons to action, invitations to practices and bold claims. But it was by no means only Frantz Fanon who Labi so admired for wielding the sharpened edges of language as a weapon. One need only look at Labi's prologue in Souffle's first issue to get some sense of the political passion of his prose. For Labi, poet, playwright, editor-in-chief for 6 years, Souffle was a place to shape unfettered words. What Foucault would borrow from the ancient Greeks, a form of parrhesia, the word for truth, that translates as nothing less than fearless speech. Labi's prologue to that first issue of Souffle is cutting and strong. It's a manifesto, and those who participate in Souffle are taking a stand, he says. It condemns a sclerosis of creativity, the prance of Moroccan poets showing up and applauded at tame international gatherings, don't know what he'd say about this one, to sell their tepid wares. Or we might think to turn to the words of the Moroccan poet Mohammed Kadir Eddine, often referred to as the Moroccan Rimbaud, who was known for his explosive expressiveness. In a letter he wrote to L'Abbe that appeared just after the latter's prologue, we are privy to a tone and temper that just might be taken as the poetic truth of their entire collective project and turbulent prose. He wrote this: all of those from here, he was living in central France at the time, who claim to be of the avant-garde delude themselves. The avant-garde is all that is done in Africa. Point. That's the end of it. A bold declaration, an assertion, and a refusal, a powerful, unmitigated claim. It did more than put Europe and its originary myths in question. Here was the identification of another fulcrum of creative dissent. It wasn't that, oh, let's just bring them in too. Actually, the fulcrum is changed. The power of recalcitrance is my last paragraph. The apprenticeship of the avant-garde. Disruptions are key to the anti-colonial avant-garde. They promise and offer other configurations of, I think some we brought up earlier today, horizontal movements, of which colony to metropole is only one interlude rehearsed along the way. So it's not all this vertical movement between metropole, colony, metropole, colony. Here are other locations to map, translocations to follow, a mobile protean archive that slices across continents, that paints bold swaths across separated landscapes, that reimagines the Caribbean. And this is what Susan César thought of, not as cut-off islands, but as an archipelago of creative political innovation. So she has this idea that it has to be just totally revamped in its thought. What is so striking in tracking this possibility, this new archive of these avant-garde, is how many threads are tied without producing a weave of duplication. It's not mimetic in any way. The Black Panthers show up at the tail end again and again. But one could also imagine other threads that celebrate the Cuban-born artist Wilfredo Lam, who died in 1982, his friendship with Picasso, and then his own heritage of mixed African, Spanish, Chinese kinship. Or one might take, and this is sort of my newest entry, an Egyptian surrealism that joined aesthetic struggles and political activism in Egypt between 1938 and 1948. And their manifesto, which was long live degenerate art, as a direct response to Hitler's condemnation of modern art. The point here is that there are a rich set of interlaced maps, what I would suggest in the new archive that's being done here, that are 3- and 4-dimensional. Maps to draw as we ask why such a constellation has remained submerged for so long, and how we might look at its immediate and distant resonances now. For here are apprenticeships, I'm thinking. Apprenticeships, not that you do it the same way. You learn how to do it. You learn how to think. You learn how to ask those questions. For here are apprenticeships. I think here of apprenticeships because one has a sense of a learning and a leaning on those who came before, an admiration, a critique, an admiration again. These appear as lines of flight to what were imagined as newly conceived senses of the political. They are really redefining what is political, not only inserting and saying, okay, that's what it is, and a new politics of aesthetics. Might this be a new way of writing, both a colonial history of the present and a history of the anti-colonial future with its protean archive in our collective mist and information? Thank you. I must say I've never just taken an opportunity like this. I just thank you all to write something totally new. absolutely decided this was extraordinary, the project that you're all involved in. And in some way, I wanted to be part of it, but not. I wanted to be askew from it, but also to engage in it. So I just want you to know that this was not ripped off from something else.
Many things. So many things to talk about it, so many things that... So I received a suggestion to give the audience the opportunity right away, but I cannot miss the opportunity to ask you a question. I would try to be very, let's say, not that abstract, because I had some ideas about could we do the same parcours, as you said, and asking ourselves what exactly is modernism and exactly is modernity and so on, but let's not do this. But yes. So, but just in a very, when you are talking, I was imagining this place that you are offering to us. This place that we can, let's say, bring to light these narratives that we're talking about. This place where we're not gonna have anymore this hierarchy of knowledge. Yeah. And imagine the place where, and of course, a place where you're not gonna refuse the story of the other, meaning you're not gonna refuse the story, the European story, because somehow it belongs to yourself. Yeah. So my question will be, this place that I'm imagining, this archive or this museum, can also be a museum, and can be created and made it here in Europe?
Is that the question? Yeah. I think it can be made anywhere. I think there's something about the sensorial. I mean, I spent a lot of time going through all the photographs of César, of Suzanne César, of the Bandung Conference, of the Moroccan writers, of the black writers in Paris. There's some kind of strength, of elegance. I'm not trying to romanticize it. There's some force that is so beyond the trite caricatures of maybe picking up on something folkloric from Africa or something primitive and elevating. No, it is as golden. It is as powerful, and it's not a rejection. That's what I also find. How strong do you have to be not to reject Europe, but say, I'll take from it what I need, but it's not my centerfold. That's the other part that has really struck me. They're not saying I don't want to speak to Sartre, or I don't want to speak to Bataille, or I don't want to speak to Michel Leiris. They're saying something else. That's a kind of other, not even appropriation, but a way of learning. And I find, I was blown away by the power of it, because you don't have to subsume yourself. It wasn't a process, as Marx would call, of subsumption, right? Of being taken over by, and therefore being only a mimetic of in any way. Nor was it Homi Bhabha's story of I'm white but not quite, as if you wanted to be white. Not even close to that story. That's what I find fascinating. Why don't we have more of that account of there's no way anyone wanted Suzanne César to do or be anything other than what she did. There's no other level up there that she was supposed to attain. She's école normale in philosophy. I mean, in 1930s, how extraordinary. To do that now would be breathtaking, right? For any of us. But she just went there. How did she do that? What kind of equanimity sense of a tempered brilliance did she have, where she didn't have to announce herself? I don't know. I just think we have something to learn.
A question? Okay.
I think it's on. And thank you so much. You know, it's always a pleasure listening to you. I actually stayed attentive, so thank you for that.
Well, I just was following you.
Listening to you talk about Abdelatif Labi, talk about Suzanne Césaire and of course Aimé and all this, and actually reading from them, quoting them, I had to think of something I've been thinking of also in a while about language as an archival space and the importance of that and how to unpack that. And you would see that in all these writings, right? Tropic being, one of those spaces. But at the same time, I felt like relating that to what is happening, say, in Cameroon at the moment, where you have the Anglophones fighting against the Francophones, to put it in simple terms. So, how does that language then become a space where that thing you've called the colonial duress is being expressed? So the archival space of the language, which serves as a space of the Liberation Act, also serves as a space in which that colonial duress, is manifested.
One of the things that I'm really struck by, and I mean, I feel so much more work needs to be done, but there's a kind of play with language. Doris Summers has a beautiful book called Bilingual Aesthetics. I don't know how many of you know it, but it's instead of thinking of having two languages, one is a deficit and one isn't, it's that movement between them. There's something going on in the facility and the ease with which they move between different genres. And the jeux de mots that are being played, and the Indonesians have never been part of the story. When I was reading again this book that I had read as a graduate student on A World in Motion, it's called by Takahashi, I always thought it was just about the popular movement. I didn't realize how many extraordinary novelists and artists were part of that early movement. And when what they do is they twist a lot of the work. They twist the Dutch language, and they make it crude, something that was taken as elevated, or calling, the scraping of Javanese, high and low, acting like frogs. There's a play. There's some kind of really sophisticated play that I can only admire because it's so political. It's so what we define critique as, right? It's also making fun of oneself. One of the things that's very strong in a lot of this is being really angry about Martinicans who are too into folklore and think that's poetry. So it's not just that they're criticizing something, the colonizer or who's ever blanc, or le petit blanc. It's internal as well, and it moves with some kind of a facility between these different genres that seem to me very enabling. When Foucault says that critique is reflective insolence, it's not that I'm going to be critical of you. It's how critical I can be of me and how well I can do it, right? And I feel that's some of what they do, really. I'm not sure. I mean, this really is, for me, like an opening of so much. But when I started seeing, every time I've spoken to another friend who was a poet or an artist, they say, oh, but don't you know the stuff in Morocco, Anne? On souffle. I said, well, no. And don't you know this on that? And don't you know this on that? And then I started going back to Indonesia, where I lived 40 years ago and was back this January, and realized, there's a whole popular movement right now that's around genre of language. And I'm going, wow, what do we need to understand better? But the other big question is how the political is being redefined. And I think Rancière's work, for those of you who say, oh God, Rancière, I think it's amazing his work around aesthetics and politics. I think understanding how much politics there is in the aesthetic and what kind of work we can do around the poetics of dissent, right, is going to be critical to us right now. We're not doing very well on other fronts.
Another question?
Thank you for that. Thank you.
You know, I tell a very strange story, and then we can talk a bit about this strange story. And in the early 60s, we are already after the non-aligned movement that came from the late 50s, right? Yeah. So there was this Portuguese philosopher that, of course, I'm not going to remember his name. But anyway, he started to develop a project of a museum that should be called the Museum of the South Atlantic. So he decided to develop this project that he understood that the south hemisphere of the planet should be connected. Every country should be in totally connected, the whole continent, this hemisphere of the world. And then he decided to create a museum for it that should be made of pieces from each one of these countries. But he was not interested only in art. He was interested in have a boat from Indonesia. He was interested in have some clothes from India and etc. And I tell this story because of this. He was Portuguese and he was living in Latin America and etc. And then he made this proposal that Portugal should leave Europe and be part of the project of the South Atlantic, not only as a museum, but as a new civilization somehow.
That's really interesting because that's what Suzanne César keeps saying. In fact, she gets off on very strange. Do people know who Frobenius is? He was an anthropologist from the turn of the century who collected African art. I mean, it's so important now with all the stuff going on around restitution. But I've always thought of him, I had to give a set of lectures in Frankfurt in his name, and I thought he was just sort of horrible. She got very excited. She said he had another vision of what a new civilization could be built upon. And all of them had, I mean, what's hard reading some of this stuff is it's very utopian and very visionary, and at the same time it's very hard and very down on the ground. And it changes modality. And when it goes to this kind of utopian spot, my eyes got blurry and, I roll them and then I say, well, why are you so, contemptuous of the utopian here? And I find it's, Foucault says the best place you can be is in an ethics of discomfort. And this stuff makes me really uncomfortable. Because when I read Richard Wright, who I'm supposed to really like, I see him as any white American who's just so narrow and provincial, it's unbelievable. He loves, that he's in Africa and that people are wearing headdresses or whatever. It's unbelievable. He's so provincial. And he's even it's been argued, pretty anti-racist towards Chinese. He has a whole set of things around him. There's nothing where you can put these people on a pedestal. They are trying to find a space to occupy at this particular moment in the world right? And it's a lot in the 30s, it's through the 40s under Vichy, and it's in the 50s again. And then in Indonesia, they get slapped down, the Communist Party. 1 million people are killed, everything's shut down, there's never a history written, ever has there been a history yet written of this really, really kind of subversive literary movement in Indonesia in the 50s. It was always my dream to write it. I don't know where the material would actually be. So it seems to me that this has to be a collaborative project among a lot of people who are working in different areas, in Arabic, in different languages, and using those, because those languages are being played with in all of these small, these little journals, these reviews. This is a genre. This is a genre. We were talking about what does a small museum do? This is a genre of that moment. It doesn't cost a lot, right? And they circulate it. And the fact that it's in the grocery, and André Breton finds it in the grocery store, in the bodega or whatever, everyone loves. But there's something, I guess, about the fact that he finds it there that really intrigues people. So is this popular? I don't know how popular. I looked for pictures all over of who was at Bandung besides the big guys and their wives in ethnic dress. And it was very hard to find besides the 600 journalists from around the world. It was and all the hotels were taken up. I did read about that and which hotels were taken up in Bandung. But it was very hard to see what came out of that was really in any way subaltern. And according to these dear friends, Amer Mufti and Stasis Kangorias, who've been studying this, they say, look, the late Bandung was actually very radical. And they line up all these other people that I mentioned as late Bandung, but not the people who were at Bandung themselves. So, we have work to do, it seems.
One question there, and one question there.
I was just curious. We've engaged with this question actually before. I'm just curious about your opinion about also the gap between the international or transnational politics that are expressed and engaged with in Bandung, for example, versus the national politics that some of the so-called man participants. International ideology of the Bandung participants,
right.
Sukarno, Nasser, etc., versus the national politics, actually. And so this gap between, humanitarian values on the outside and actually extremely repressive regimes on a national level. And I don't know. I mean, we've engaged with this question before, but it's just
I didn't get to it all through this because it's very difficult. It's very difficult and people really put aside is how important communism was within the story in the 50s. And Lekra was seen as, when I was younger, when I was in graduate school, I thought they were God. I thought, Lekra, they were standing there, they were strong. I didn't understand that they actually were squashing an avant-garde. They were so socialist realism. It was so tight. You had to be doing it in a certain way. I didn't get that. There was nobody's written about it, that there was a whole other earlier movement that refused that. And then, so Breton was in the Communist Party. Everybody was in the Communist Party. César, they all were. But we don't know what to do with that side of it very well. I don't know who's done that really well. Somehow that's still cast apart. But that is their reality at that moment. They want Chou En-lai there. They want to know that he's supporting them, but not too close. Something that I can't get yet. My own personal history is that I just have to tell you this because it's so apt. I was working on the Indonesian labor movement in Indonesia as a graduate student, and I decided that I was writing my dissertation in Paris, and I met the children of the former head of the Indonesian Communist Party, and they got me invitations to China to interview all the former labor leaders from Indonesia. And many of them were lacquer, and I had no idea at that time how parochially communist they were. Well, had to be. They were living in China. I don't know. But that's who I was interviewing in 1982.
Just a last question, right?
My question is about archives. Sorry, you didn't want to speak about it. It's.
Not that I don't want to. I love speaking about it.
You mentioned all those great sources. We were really traveling with you through boxes, archives, and now I was asking myself, where do you access the files? Do you travel to Asia, Africa? What is your experience? Or do you see everything in Paris? Or
Are you asking me personally, or
yes,
what will we all do
or do you
collectively?
collect the files yourself? Are they at your home, or would you?
Oh, this is a very long answer. I mean, Google. No, I mean, I have probably 50 boxes. You know those steel boxes, and each one has something special in it in a certain way. And I ship them around all the time, and they're constantly moving and they're realigning. And I do a lot on Google, but I also really depend on relationships, on you know, not collaboration in a formal way, but on friendships and intellectual friendships. And I mean, my whole first book, Race and the Education of Desire, must have been 30 people I spoke to in writing that book. You know, and it has to come at a certain point in your life when you feel comfortable enough doing that. I knew I didn't know enough about this, and I knew people who did. And I wasn't going to pretend that I was going to come here and tell you all about the avant-garde, right? I mean, coming to this group of people. So I had to learn about it in another kind of way, through what I really know from 40 years of looking at the forms of governance. It was almost like a negative print. To see what they were fighting was what I knew from the other side. Because I spent so much time in those archives, those official archives. I knew what they were, what common sense they were putting their noses up against, right? And so there's a very deep relationship between what I've studied and this, what I wrote. But it's not the same. It's totally another space. That's all I know.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anne.